Women's Weird.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I have to ask, what is Women's Weird? What does it mean?
Weird fiction encompasses ghost stories, supernatural, horror, fantasy, bit of science fiction. Not much though. It's an all-embracing term. It was invented in the 1920s, mainly because of the popularity of H.P. Lovecraft, who wrote stories about many tentacled gods called Cthulhu. And it was very, very dark indeed. So his fiction was called weird fiction to differentiate it from other science fiction strands, from ghost stories, you might say. It began as an American thing and then the Brits adopted it too. So weird fiction has been a thing for a long time. In the 1990s, China Miéville reinvented the term, calling a strand of very hard-edged science fiction and fantasy as the new weird, with a capital W. But that doesn't concern us. I was reviewing a new academic book about weird fiction from the late Victorian period to the 1930s. And I was reading it with great interest, going, yeah, tick, 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 yes, good, yes. Where are the women? Where are the women? Because the author of the book hardly touched on women writers at all. He was looking at a great deal of magazine writers, authors who sold their fiction to magazine stories because you could sell a lot several times over and get good money for it. And I knew full well that women were writing magazine fiction in vast amounts. So why was this author not discussing women's weird fiction? So with that in mind, I went to Melissa Edmundson, who is an academic I've worked with before on another project, and I knew that her speciality was the colonial ghost story and Victorian ghost stories and supernatural fiction from the 20th century. And I said, Melissa, where are the weird women? And she said, I'll send you a list. So she sent me a list of about 16 stories, which I read, and I threw out some, and she replaced them, and we came down to a final list of 14 short stories by women, dating from about the 1880s to 1942.
So what are the authors, who are the authors featured in this collection?
The most famous author would be Edith Wharton, very famous for her high society New York novels and European fashion novels from early 20th century. We've got May Sinclair, an important modernist writer from the early 20th century. Margaret Oliphant, who's a Victorian writer, very, very creepy story about a ghost door. Mary Butts, one of the modernist essayists and novelists, also into fantasy. D.K. Broster, who I remember at school as being one of the great Scottish historical novelists, but I hadn't realised that she was a woman because D.K. Broster. E. Nesbit, 5 Children and It. She was a prolific short story writer for any magazine that would take her fiction. She had to earn a living. And she's written an extraordinary short story. And Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who's most famous for her long short story called The Yellow Wallpaper, which is routinely taught in every literature class that involves feminism and gender and the treatment of women in the early 20th century.
So the stories, what are they about?
Oh, they're about ghosts and supernaturals and hauntings and horror, really horrific things happening to men, quite often mostly to men. There's a really nasty manifestation of revenge which takes the form of a feather boa that creeps along the floor. And you get fragments of feather which show you that someone else is in the room. There is a very good story about haunted gloves. Gloves found in a box in the attic. We've got 2 cottages which are both one building, and the gloves start to appear in places where they ought not to appear and nobody has put them. And it's because of the owner of the gloves who died horribly in the river. There's quite a lot of domestic detail, but honestly these are scary, brilliant stories.
And so it's the first time they've been collected together in one volume?
It is. Many of them have, we have the rights. Some of them are out of copyright and some are not. We've paid for the rights. So it's a collection that's not likely to appear again. And they're brought together because they have a common theme of trying to frighten the reader out of their wits. And they're by women, and they have an interestingly alternative take on how weird fiction in all its manifestations was written over this period.
So it's a great Halloween read then?
Oh, I think so, and that's why we're bringing it out at Halloween.
Thank you very much.